In the summer of 2022, the suburban streets of Willow Creek, Austin, Texas, basked in a deceptive calm. Rows of pristine houses with manicured lawns hid the quiet tensions of a tightly knit community. On the surface, Willow Creek exuded perfection, friendly neighbors, weekend barbecues, and a sense of shared security. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, fueled by whispers, glances, and unspoken divides. One of these cracks widened with the arrival of Diego Morales, a 27-year-old Venezuelan immigrant who had settled in a modest apartment in the neighboring Willow Pines complex. Diego had come to America in search of a better life, fleeing the economic turmoil of his homeland. He brought with him only a suitcase, a weathered bicycle, and a heart full of determination. His days were long and grueling, spent at Lone Star Auto Repairs, where he quickly became known for his precision and tireless work ethic. Yet, for all his efforts, Diego remained an outsider in Willow Creek. The community wasn't hostile outright, but the polite nods and brief greetings carried an undertone of mistrust. The neighborhood's unwritten rules were clear: Diego didn't belong. He endured it all with silent resilience, finding solace in the hum of engines and the faint hope that one day, he might carve out a place for himself. Across Willow Creek, in a house that stood as a symbol of affluence, Sofia Rivera stared out of her large kitchen window, feeling every inch of the emotional prison her life had become. At 32, Sofia was a striking woman of Puerto Rican descent who had once dreamed of a life filled with love and purpose. Her marriage to Michael Rivera, a successful corporate executive, had promised her everything she thought she wanted: stability, status, and a beautiful home. But over time, Sofia realized her marriage was as hollow as the elegant decor surrounding her. Michael, always preoccupied with work and appearances, had little time or patience for his wife's emotional needs. To him, Sofia's role was simple: to maintain the image of a perfect spouse. The warmth and laughter she had once possessed had long since faded, replaced by a quiet desperation that gnawed at her during the long, silent hours she spent alone. It was during one of these days, in late May, that Sofia's car broke down just a few miles from her home. Frustrated and seeking help, she stumbled upon Lone Star Auto Repairs. Diego, his hands slick with grease, looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of politeness and mild curiosity. Their interaction was brief, a simple consultation about the engine, but in that fleeting exchange, Sofia noticed something she hadn't seen in years: kindness. Diego's voice was calm, his manner patient. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt seen. Days later, Sofia found herself returning to Lone Star, ostensibly for a follow-up on her car but truly drawn by an intangible pull she couldn't yet name. Diego, though reserved, began to open up, sharing snippets of his journey to America, his family back in Venezuela, and his struggles to find acceptance in Willow Creek. Sofia, in turn, revealed pieces of her life, her Puerto Rican heritage, and the loneliness she endured in her marriage. In these small moments, something began to shift. The air between them grew warmer, their conversations longer, tinged with a familiarity that neither of them could ignore. For Diego, Sofia represented a flicker of light in an otherwise isolating world. For Sofia, Diego was a reminder of the person she used to be: vibrant, free, and full of dreams. But Willow Creek was a neighborhood of watchful eyes, and even the smallest spark could ignite a wildfire. By early June, Sofia Rivera found herself lingering longer at Lone Star Auto Repairs than she had any reason to. The faint excuse of needing more advice on her car's condition became a convenient justification for her increasingly frequent visits. Diego Morales, initially cautious, began to relax in her presence. Their exchanges grew warmer, more personal, as if they were old friends rediscovering each other. One humid afternoon, Sofia stepped into the garage with 2 iced coffees in hand. Diego looked up from beneath the hood of a battered sedan, his face glistening with sweat. "You looked like you could use this," Sofia said, her voice light but her smile hinting at something deeper. Diego hesitated, glancing around the garage. It wasn't common for customers to show this kind of kindness. Yet, as her smile lingered, he found himself accepting the coffee with a quiet, "Thank you." The simple gesture felt like an unspoken invitation, and it wasn't long before their conversations moved beyond the garage. Sophia suggested meeting at Cactus Brew, a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of Willow Creek. The first time, it was accidental, at least that's what she told herself. She happened to be there and thought Diego might want to join her. But by the second and third meetings, there was no longer any pretense. Their time together became a ritual, a sanctuary where the noise of their separate lives couldn't intrude. At the cafe, Sophia spoke freely about her frustrations, the weight of expectations, the emptiness of her marriage, and the isolation she felt in a house that was supposed to symbolize her success. Diego listened intently, his brown eyes filled with an empathy that Sophia hadn't encountered in years. In turn, he shared stories of his family back in Venezuela, the sacrifices he had made to come to America, and the loneliness of being treated as an outsider. "I left everything behind to build something here," Diego said one evening, his voice tinged with quiet bitterness. "But no matter how hard I try, I'm always just a stranger to them." Sophia placed her hand on his, a small gesture of comfort. "You're not a stranger to me," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Diego looked at her hand, then at her face, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if there could be more to this connection than just friendship. But the boundaries of their relationship were becoming harder to define. What began as a fragile connection between two lonely souls was shifting into something neither could fully control. Sophia started spending less time at home, finding excuses to step out for errands or coffee runs that stretched on for hours. Diego, once meticulous about keeping to himself, now found his thoughts drifting toward her in stolen moments of the day. Unbeknownst to them, their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed. Willow Creek was a neighborhood of unrelenting curiosity, where even the smallest deviation from routine drew attention. A neighbor, Nancy Carter, happened to spot Sophia's car parked near the garage more than once. "She's been spending a lot of time over there, hasn't she?" Nancy remarked to her husband one evening. Her tone was light, but her words carried the seeds of gossip that would soon spread. Meanwhile, back at the Rivera household, Michael Rivera had begun to sense something was amiss. Sophia's usual routine had shifted subtly but unmistakably. She seemed distant, distracted, her responses curt and evasive. Michael's suspicions deepened when he noticed Sophia had started wearing makeup more frequently, something she hadn't done for years. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Michael watched Sophia intently. "You've been out a lot lately," he said, his voice calm but probing. Sophia glanced up, her fork paused mid-air. "Just running errands," she replied, forcing a smile. But the unease in her eyes betrayed her. Michael didn't press further, but the silence that followed was louder than any argument. The next day, Michael decided to follow Sophia. He kept a distance as her car pulled out of their driveway and navigated toward Lone Star Auto Repairs. Parking discreetly a block away, he watched as Sophia entered the garage. Through the window, he could see her laughing softly at something Diego had said. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his jaw clenching as he felt a surge of anger and humiliation rise within him. That evening, he didn't confront Sophia. Instead, he began to plan, his mind racing with scenarios that ranged from rational to impulsive. For Michael, this wasn't just about his wife's betrayal. It was about control, the control he thought he had over his marriage, his life, and his image in Willow Creek. Back at Lone Star, Diego began to sense the weight of what was happening. His connection with Sophia had crossed a line, and though they hadn't spoken of it, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. He knew the risks, but he couldn't seem to walk away. For Sophia, Diego was a lifeline, a reminder of the person she used to be. For Diego, Sophia was a fleeting moment of warmth in a life defined by cold indifference. Neither of them knew how close the fire they were playing with was to consuming them both. By late July, the tension in Willow Creek had reached a fever pitch. Sophia and Diego's connection, once a quiet solace, had become impossible to ignore. The whispers in the community grew louder, carried by neighbors like Nancy Carter, who found every opportunity to speculate on Sophia's frequent absences. But the most dangerous shift was happening inside the Rivera household, where Michael Rivera's suspicions had hardened into certainty. Michael had always prided himself on control, over his career, his marriage, and his image. But control had slipped through his fingers like sand. The sight of Sophia with Diego at Lone Star Auto Repairs had been the final crack in the dam. That night, sitting alone in his study, Michael poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at the shadows cast by the dim light. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, humiliation, and an insatiable need to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The confrontation came on a humid evening in late July. Michael, having trailed Sophia once again, parked his car a block away from Willow Pines, the modest apartment complex where Diego lived. From the shadows, he watched as Sophia knocked on Diego's door. The door opened, and Michael caught a fleeting glimpse of Diego's face, calm, unassuming, utterly unaware of the storm about to break. Michael waited until the door closed before stepping out of his car. His footsteps were heavy but deliberate as he approached the apartment. Inside, Sophia and Diego were seated at the small dining table, their conversation light yet tinged with the same unspoken tension that had hung between them for weeks. Sophia was mid-sentence when a sharp knock interrupted her. Her heart jumped. Diego's eyes darted to the door. "Are you expecting someone?" Sophia whispered, her voice laced with unease. Diego shook his head, rising cautiously. He opened the door to find Michael standing there, his expression cold and unreadable. "Michael?" Sophia's voice trembled as she stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Michael stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze shifting between Sophia and Diego. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. "So this is what you've been doing," Michael said, his voice low and sharp, like the calm before a storm. "Sneaking around like a common liar." Sophia's face flushed with a mixture of shame and defiance. "Michael, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off. "Explain what?" Michael snapped, his tone rising. "That you've been throwing away everything I built for you?" "For him?" He jabbed a finger in Diego's direction, his voice dripping with contempt. "An immigrant mechanic? Is this what you've reduced yourself to?" Diego stiffened at the insult, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't have the right to talk to her like that," he said, his voice steady but firm. Michael turned to Diego, his eyes blazing. "And you," he spat. "You think you can just walk into my life and take what's mine? You don't belong here. You've never belonged here." The words hung in the air like a slap. For a moment, silence fell, thick and suffocating. Sophia stood frozen, caught between the two men, one representing the life she longed to escape, the other the fragile hope she had clung to. But Diego refused to back down. "I didn't take anything from you," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Whatever is wrong in your life, it's not because of me." The calmness in Diego's tone only enraged Michael further. He took a threatening step forward, his fists trembling with barely contained fury. Sophia moved between them, her hands raised. "Stop it. Both of you," she cried, her voice breaking. But the damage had been done. Michael's anger boiled over, and he hurled one final accusation at Sophia: "You've destroyed everything we had." "And for what?" "Him." The confrontation ended abruptly when Michael stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the small apartment, leaving Sophia and Diego standing in stunned silence. Sophia's hands trembled as she covered her face, tears spilling over. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered. Diego placed a hand on her shoulder, but his eyes were fixed on the door, where the shadow of Michael's rage still lingered. "He's not going to let this go," Diego said quietly, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. That night, back at his house, Michael sat in the dark, replaying the confrontation over and over in his mind. His fury was no longer a mere emotion, it was a purpose. He couldn't bear the thought of Sofia choosing someone else, least of all Diego. In his eyes, this wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation, an assault on his pride and his authority. He poured another drink, his hand trembling, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Meanwhile, Sofia and Diego tried to find solace in each other's company, but the unease in the air was palpable. They both knew the situation had escalated beyond their control. Sofia's heart ached with guilt, torn between the life she had and the life she wanted. Diego, though calm on the surface, felt the shadow of Michael's anger looming over him, growing darker with every passing moment. Neither of them realized just how close that shadow was to engulfing them. The night of August 15, 2022, shattered the deceptive quiet of Willow Creek. It began with muffled shouts emanating from Diego Morales's modest apartment at Willow Pines. Neighbors, accustomed to the quiet hum of their suburban enclave, stirred uneasily as the tension escalated into a cacophony of crashing furniture and desperate cries. When the piercing wail of a woman's scream sliced through the air, the unease turned to alarm. By the time the police arrived, summoned by a trembling neighbor's call, the scene inside the apartment was one of devastation. Diego Morales lay lifeless on the floor, his body bearing the unmistakable marks of a violent struggle. Blood smeared across the walls and shattered belongings painted a harrowing picture of a life extinguished too soon. Nearby, Sofia Rivera knelt on the ground, her hands stained with crimson, her sobs the only sound in the room. "I couldn't stop him," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I couldn't stop him." The initial hours of the investigation unfolded under the harsh glare of flashing blue lights. Detective Elena Torres, a seasoned investigator with the Travis County Police Department, surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "This wasn't random," she said quietly to her partner, gesturing at the state of the apartment. "This was personal." The first suspect on the list was Michael Rivera, and the evidence quickly began to stack against him. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex showed his car parked outside that evening, despite his insistence that he had been at home all night. A search of Michael's vehicle and belongings revealed faint traces of blood on the steering wheel and a pair of bruised knuckles he couldn't adequately explain. When questioned, Michael's demeanor was calm but detached, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions surrounding him. "I went there to talk sense into him," he said during his initial interrogation, his voice eerily composed. Nothing more. But his words rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence. Meanwhile, Sofia was pulled into the investigation, her every word and action scrutinized. The weight of the tragedy bore heavily on her, etching deep lines of grief and guilt into her face. "I never thought he was capable of this," she told Detective Torres, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was angry, yes, but I didn't think he would actually hurt Diego." Sofia's testimony painted a chilling portrait of the events leading up to the murder. She recounted the escalating tensions, Michael's increasing possessiveness, and the explosive confrontation in Diego's apartment weeks earlier. But her words also hinted at her own turmoil, the guilt of choices made and the devastating consequences they had wrought. The investigation soon uncovered another layer of darkness. Forensic analysis of Michael's phone revealed a trail of damning messages. Texts and emails exchanged with colleagues and friends hinted at a deep-seated prejudice against Diego, whom Michael referred to as just another immigrant trying to take what isn't his. These messages shifted the narrative, painting Michael not as a man overcome by the heat of the moment, but as someone whose actions were fueled by long-standing resentment and pride. As the evidence mounted, the community of Willow Creek was plunged into turmoil. Neighbors whispered about the Rivera scandal behind closed doors, their reactions ranging from shock to quiet vindication. "I always knew there was something off about him," muttered Nancy Carter to a friend during a morning coffee run. Others were less forgiving, their sympathy leaning toward Michael. "What was she thinking, sneaking around like that?" one neighbor murmured. "She brought this on herself." By January 2023, the case against Michael Rivera was ready to go to trial. The prosecution, led by David Clark, argued that Michael had been driven by a toxic mix of jealousy, humiliation, and prejudice. They framed him as a man who couldn't accept losing control of his wife, his image, or his carefully curated life. In the courtroom, the prosecution unveiled the full extent of Michael's actions. The jury listened as the damning texts were read aloud, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. Witnesses, including neighbors and co-workers, testified to Michael's growing anger in the weeks leading up to Diego's murder. One neighbor admitted to overhearing a heated phone conversation in which Michael had said, "I'll deal with him myself." Sophia's testimony became a turning point in the trial. Her voice trembled as she recounted the affair, the confrontation, and the fear that gripped her the night Michael killed Diego. Her words painted her not only as a key witness but also as a tragic figure, someone caught in a whirlwind of choices and consequences that spiraled beyond her control. The defense, led by Richard Cohen, attempted to paint Michael as a victim of circumstance, a betrayed husband who acted in a moment of emotional duress. But the prejudice revealed in his private messages undermined this narrative, exposing a darker, more calculated side to his actions. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift and unyielding, life imprisonment without parole. As the judge read the decision, Michael's expression remained stoic, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of the moment. For Sophia, the verdict brought no solace. She returned to Willow Creek, where the community's judgment awaited her. Some saw her as a victim of circumstance, others as the catalyst for the tragedy. The house she shared with Michael now stood empty, a hollow reminder of a life that had crumbled under the weight of secrets and lies. Diego's family, unable to attend the trial, held a quiet vigil in Venezuela to honor his memory. "He came to America with hope," his sister said during a tearful speech. But he found only rejection and hatred. As the media attention faded and Willow Creek resumed its carefully curated routines, the shadow of Diego's murder lingered. The case left behind a fractured community, torn between sympathy and judgment, and a question that hung heavy in the air: could this tragedy have been avoided if understanding and compassion had prevailed? The verdict of Michael Rivera's trial may have brought legal closure, but the emotional wounds it left behind in Willow Creek were far from healed. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once a place of carefully maintained appearances, now bore the scars of a tragedy that had exposed the fractures lying just beneath its polished surface. For Sofia Rivera, life after the trial was a hollow existence. The once opulent home she had shared with Michael felt like a mausoleum, filled with the echoes of what had been lost. Neighbors whispered about her when she passed by, their glances heavy with judgment. Some pitied her, viewing her as a woman caught in a web of bad choices and worse circumstances. Others were less forgiving, blaming her outright for igniting the chain of events that led to Diego's death. Sofia tried to rebuild her life, but the weight of her guilt and shame followed her wherever she went. She eventually sold the house and moved to a smaller apartment on the outskirts of Austin, seeking anonymity and a chance to start over. But in the quiet moments, when the world fell away, she still saw Diego's face and heard the echoes of Michael's rage. The choices she had made, however unintended their consequences, haunted her. For Diego Morales, there were no second chances. His death became a stark symbol of what happens when prejudice and unchecked anger collide. The modest belongings he left behind were shipped to his family in Venezuela, who mourned him from thousands of miles away. At his small memorial service, his sister spoke through tears. Diego dreamed of a better life, but all he found was rejection. He deserved so much more. The immigrant community in Willow Creek, though small, felt the sting of Diego's story acutely. For them, his death was not an isolated tragedy but a reflection of the struggles they all faced, of being seen as outsiders in a place they tried so hard to call home. Quiet vigils were held in his honor, moments of solidarity that also served as silent protests against the prejudice that had contributed to his untimely end. Willow Creek itself was forever changed. The facade of unity that the neighborhood once prided itself on had been stripped away, revealing a patchwork of divisions. While some residents reflected on the biases that had allowed the situation to escalate, others doubled down, quietly justifying Michael's actions as those of a husband pushed too far. The story of Diego, Sophia, and Michael became a cautionary tale, one whispered about at neighborhood gatherings and recounted in hushed tones to newcomers. It was a tale of love, betrayal, and tragedy, but more than that, it was a reflection of how easily unspoken tensions and prejudices could spiral into violence. The memory of Diego Morales lingered like a shadow, a reminder of what happens when empathy is absent and anger takes its place. And for those who bore witness to the events of that fateful summer, the question remained, what could have been done to prevent this? Who do you think bears the most responsibility for this tragedy, Sophia, Michael, or the community around them? Do you think Michael's sentence was justified, or was it too harsh? Could this story have had a different ending if the characters had made different choices? Share your perspective in the comments below. Let us know what you think about the decisions made, the consequences faced, and the lessons this story holds for all of us. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that delve into the complexities of human relationships and the impact of our choices.